Hi, welcome to this very special edition of Diaspora Voices on JKTV. And in today's show, we will be discussing some very significant issues about education and multiculturalism and partition and ethnic minorities and Kashmiris. So we know that in Britain, the history of race relation and multiculturalism and educating people about different cultures and histories and to bring people together or closer, it goes quite back. But uh, throughout these years, uh, the British Kashmiris were somehow lumped or uh, put together with other Asian categories, mainly India and Pakistan, depending which side of the divide in Kashmir you come from. Um, and, very little was known about British Kashmiris. Even now, not many people know that two-thirds of British Pakistanis actually originate from Kashmir, mainly from the Pakistani administered side of Kashmir. So, apart from academics and some people who are very much interested in all these different communities, different British communities, uh, many ordinary people don't know much about British Kashmiris. However, through the work of people like Roger Ballard, Professor Zafar Khan, Dr. Varinder Singh Kalra, and recently Dr. Nasreen Ali, Dr. Serena Hussain, and Dr. Kramat Iqbal. These people mainly of British Kashmiri background. Through their work, more and more people are becoming aware in academia and in educational settings that while uh, the histories and cultures or needs and issues are covered related to other communities, uh, but there is not much um, about British Kashmiris, particularly not taught much in schools, not included much in school curriculum. But even in that area now, some a significant progress is coming to the knowledge of people who are interested in this community, and some very interesting work is going on. So today we will talk about um, the British Kashmiris, but also in the context of British ethnic minorities and the wider curriculum around multiculturalism and other communities. So to talk about that, we have three very learned experts in the field who are doing work on different aspects of uh, various communities and different aspects of multiculturalism. We have with us Dr. Richard Reyes, who will be talking about multiculturalism and how it is applicable today, and how different communities can be part of this, and how it can be taught, in schools or included in the curriculum. And after that, we will have with us Dr. Alison Davies, who did a very interesting research for Peterborough Racial Equality Council. And the research was about the views of Kashmiri heritage students at secondary schools in Peterborough. So, and then we have Dr. Kramat Iqbal, who is a host of Diaspora Voices, and also author of Dear Birmingham, I think, and is working intensively on various aspects of minority education, and especially with special focus on British Kashmiris recently. So I welcome all my guests in the studio, and then we will take over this conversation further. So welcome all of you, Dr. Kramat Iqbal, Dr. Richard Race, and Dr. Alison Davies. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, brilliant. Right. So I would start with Dr. Richard, and then we will, I'll go to Dr. Alison and then Dr. Kramat Iqbal. So, Dr. Richard, first of all, I think everybody would like to know that what is multiculturalism?
Thank you, Shams, and thank you for the invitation from JKTV. What is multiculturalism? Well, if you take the term multi means many. And then if you add that to culture, you have many cultures. And I think that's really important to start with. I would also suggest that multiculturalism is political, which means it's going to be defined differently by different people, depending upon their different viewpoints. But I would argue, as I do in my own research, that multiculturalism still matters in July 2022. And we have to not only acknowledge and recognize cultural difference in society, but we also have to celebrate it. And I am certainly along the lines of celebrating difference in and between different cultures, because I think we need knowledge and knowing of different cultures, and we need to reduce fear in relation to difference. And I think that's where education comes into play. It's interesting, I'll add just very quickly, just being or putting a question mark alongside the term British. It's a question that I asked at a conference last Friday at Southbank University in London. It's a question I often ask of my students. My students tend to be baffled, third-year undergraduate students, when I teach multiculturalism and education to them, because it's quite an interesting question to ask. To colleagues on Friday at the academic conference, the terms that they came up with were quite negative. All I will say at this point is that if you take Britain to be the four countries in the United Kingdom, the four countries are very unique and very different. And we're talking international here. Inter meaning between, and national nations. So in that sense, if you're looking at different education policies, for example, you will have different policies in the four different nations, be them England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And in that sense, something to consider for the audience is that in relation to education, there are four very unique education systems, as there are countries that have four very different education policies. For example, Wales are introducing a new national curriculum in September this year. And England have had a national curriculum since 1988. And I can talk more about that if we have the time. Shams, you're on mute.
Sorry about that.
No worries.
So the next question is, you indicated a little bit, but what is the relevance of multiculturalism for today in 2022 in schools or outside of schools are?
Well, within an English
the relevance?
Within an English context in schools all over England, it's important because we need to increase our understandings of our audience. If you're a teacher, it's as simple as that. You need to know about not just Christmas and Easter, but you need to have a working knowledge of, for example, Ramadan and Eid, as well as Diwali, as well as the Chinese New Year, as well as many other celebrations that face a teacher every day in her or his professional practice. So for me, and what came out of my research from multiculturalism in education, the book whose second edition was published by Bloomsbury in 2015, the relevance of multiculturalism is before our very eyes. And in that sense today, if I'm sort of introducing this debate about Kashmiri or the Kashmiri Diaspora, then in that sense, it's a question of how that can be taught alongside issues such as Windrush, Black Lives Matter, Black history, and other subjects which are, I would suggest, available for teachers to teach. And one of the conclusions from my own research is that the national curriculum, I looked at history and citizenship at key stages 3 and 4, had culturally diverse content, and which allows teachers to be culturally diverse in their professional practice. However, how far does teacher training go to allow them to do that? And you're listening, if I identify myself as a white middle-class academic, you're looking at somebody that over the last several years has delivered the race and education lecture to teacher training, secondary school learners. So in that sense, again, why in my institution couldn't we find somebody from a culturally diverse community to be culturally diverse in front of a culturally diverse audience? So in that sense, again, there are many issues. And the one factor that goes on after that, after teacher training, cultural difference, is to provide continuing professional development so that professional practitioners increase their understandings and learn more about the difference in front of them. And I think that's crucial. And I'm afraid I don't think we're in a system that allows teacher trainees, let alone qualified teachers, the space and the time to do this.
What is multicultural education? I mean, is it just about telling children that there are different communities living here and there are different festivals, or is it more than that?
I think that's a very interesting point you raised there. I've been criticized by my culturally diverse colleagues for talking about festivals. My colleagues tell me, Richard, we were teaching this 50 years ago, maybe longer. And I'm saying to them, well, unfortunately, your white audience and the majority of white practitioners haven't even got to that stage yet. If you've got individuals working in the academy that can't say the word black and say the word coloured, we've still got a long way to go. And in that sense, I think there are colleagues that do need that support and help to build confidence, to teach difference. And it's not just within education, it's right across the board. Multicultural education provides challenges to the existing system. And again, the challenges raised from minor changes to reform to transformation. And those notions you can find quite consistently in the literature. But I think if you look at it constructively, you've got to look at multicultural education as a pedagogy, meaning a science of education that provides opportunities for majority and minority based students, however defined, but also for teachers, more importantly, because if you get the majority of teachers and provide them with the training and support to do this, then we can get different materials into the system. The system has always been the problem. Subjects like history and geography are deliberately singular. As a historian, the more interesting history for me have been histories plural. in the sense that that means you're getting debates coming from different directions. So if you're talking about the Kashmiri diaspora, you're not only talking about communities in this country and other countries within the United Kingdom, but you're talking about global dissemination and how people are getting on all over the world. Because I'm sure that the Kashmiri diaspora are not only in England or Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales. And in that sense, I think like Windrush that we can come back to, programs like this are crucial in raising awareness and providing perhaps teachers with the confidence to go out and find out more, not just about Kashmiri communities, but all communities that this series is looking at. So I'm hoping that listeners and viewers will find the time. And that's the most difficult thing, of course, when there's so much pressures on professional practitioners at all levels to find out more about their audience, about students from different culturally diverse communities.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, from your experience or, through the work you have conducted so far, what are the main challenges and what are the barriers, when it comes to teaching multiculturalism or making curriculum reflecting the multicultural nature of society?
Well, I think the national curriculum provides both challenges and opportunities. Just to remind viewers that the Welsh are introducing a new national curriculum in September 2022. I mean, if you've got half an hour, viewers, have a look at it, because it will be very different to the curriculum that's being delivered in England. If you want a comparison, and I teach this to undergraduate students at university. So in that sense, I think that's really important. The national curriculum in England, I think, is challenging because of the notion of nation. And again, it's political. So is it monocultural or multicultural? Now, as I've already said, there are opportunities to be culturally diverse within the national curriculum. If you look at, for example, key stages 3 and 4 in history and citizenship, but citizenship is a subject in England that's under pressure, and always has been in many respects. It's one of the newer subjects within the national curriculum, but there seems to be at the moment more pressure on students to get through the core subjects of English, maths and sciences. Now, even then, if you look at a subject like English literature, look at the phenomenal opportunities that you can have in relation to Indian and Pakistani literature, for example, and translating these texts into English so that the diaspora can have classical, traditional and contemporary literature from all over the world. It doesn't have to be from India and Pakistan. It can be from Spain, France, Chile, China. So in that sense, I think the national curriculum is quite restrictive in its 3 core and 7 foundation subjects. So that would be, in many respects, the challenge to find the time and the space. But the opportunities is that they are there. But it's providing that time for professional practitioners to go away, to be taught, as well as self-educating, to provide more culturally diverse options for students at all levels: nursery, primary, secondary, further, higher, right, even into adult education, right throughout the life course.
So does that help, the education process and the education which children or pupils are given or delivered in schools? I mean, this kind of decolonizing the curriculum.
Yeah, I would suggest it does, because it makes the curriculum more contemporary and relevant. I think to teach decolonizing, you have to teach colonizing stories from around the world, not just England, but the most contemporary one I would imagine would be Russia at the moment. What about China? What about other countries? What about the Americas? How were they colonized before independence? What about Australia, where the indigenous populations call Independence Day Invasion Day? What about New Zealand? What about other countries around the world? Colonizing, to understand decolonizing, you've got to understand colonizing. And there are many colonizing events that have taken place over the years, but these have to be taught. The English story is a very interesting one. But what about the French? What about the Germans? What about the Spanish, the Portuguese, the French, the Italians? And I'm not even thinking, you know, I've given you half a dozen examples from Europe. What about Asia? What about the Americas? There are many more. Got to teach it, though.
But is it not that too political?
Well, it has to be. Multiculturalism and monoculturalism are political concepts. Again, you're going to have different political parties in different countries that can teach it. Multiculturalism is not applicable in all countries around the world. You know, liberal, white, English academics might like to think that that's the case, or Anglo-speaking academics might like to think that's the case, but it's not. And there has to be a realization, as I've found out and increased my understandings of in front of culturally diverse groups, that for some of my students, it's fine to be critical of the term multiculturalism because it won't apply in countries, say, for example, in the Middle East or in Africa or in other places around the world. So we've got to have that sort of critical reflective lens when looking at notions such as multiculturalism and colonizing and decolonizing the curriculum. Hello, Shams. Are you there? Colleagues, is anybody there?
Sorry, I was asking a question from somewhere else. And so when we teach Windrush, or you know, the history of Africa, because that is very much to do with African people and their migration and going back.
Yep.
Should that include Indian and Pakistani migration and their issues?
Yes, and without question.
Should that include then Sri Lanka and Bangladesh in it? And we can say, should that include Kashmiris in it as well?
Yeah, I think this is how we've got to, in many respects, redefine curricula and provide opportunities, not just a smorgasbord of cultural diversity. But I think the Indian question is an interesting one when you think about partition, because I don't think I had a very interesting conversation with a colleague from Sri Lanka about this on Friday, a few days ago, where partition, you would associate it with the ending of the empire and then the creation of Pakistan and Bangladesh, but the movement between India and Pakistan. Now, that's debatable because I think partition is a lot more complicated than that. Conservative estimates put it that over 1 million people died in that transition when people literally, you know, millions of people had to move, you know, in one direction or the other. And in that sense, I think that is, as a historian, it's a rich vein to tell the story. And I would include Bangladesh, and I would even include Sri Lanka in that. Sri Lanka is a bit different, but again, it's difficult, I would imagine, for Britain, however defined, to say that, because that was another question that was lost. I think a lot of people of a certain age would find it difficult if they hadn't been taught it, what Sri Lanka was known before it gained independence. And then you go around the world, and I think in many respects it's specific on the class and who and what you are teaching. For example, I'm examining a doctorate in 48 hours time in Lincoln, and the doctorate, I don't think I'm breaking any ethical boundaries here by saying that it's about the Somali community within the school. So Somali and Somaliland have very interesting histories. There's the connection with the British, there's a connection with the Italians. And again, this has come up recently in the media with Mo Farah, who again has told his story of being almost a domestic slave in South London when he was brought over. His father was killed in the civil war in Somali, and his name was changed. And he's very concerned about whether he has, you know, the right to remain, which you would imagine he would do because it's the Sir in. So Mohammed Farah which even isn't his correct name, which will keep him in the country. But that story applies not only to him, but to the diaspora as well. So again, for the school in Lincoln that has this Somali community, how many teachers come from Somali or Somaliland, which I think is an interesting question, and how many of the other students actually have understanding of the context, setting the scene, the history, the language? Are there cultural facilitators within the school that can bring the gap together? Again, I have one more quick example of that. In Slough, in England, whereby in the school that had a large Polish diaspora and migration into the school, this is about 10 years ago now, so this proves that these issues are still very much alive and have been for a long time. There were 14 and 15-year-old students that were acting as translators from Polish for those that could speak both Polish and English to those that have just arrived that couldn't speak English very well. So the school at that time was almost using some of the students to initiate communication between the students and the teachers. So in that sense, I think it depends upon the audience. Again, it depends upon the students. If you're a professional practitioner, you've got to apply your professional practitioner to who's in front of you. And of course, as we all know, cultural diversity is fluid, which means you need that continuing professional development to keep teachers on their toes. Because if they don't have the cultural knowledge, what is the result going to be? You're going to have one student in the corner just playing on a phone. Again, that's not education. So in that sense, the system has to be more flexible and more fluid to cope with changes in cultural diversity. Again, think of the Ukraine and how many people, that diaspora. And of course, it's not just about housing thousands of people, maybe tens of thousands of people that are making that journey from the Ukraine to the United Kingdom. How do you educate those children? How many of them speak English? Where are the translators? You know, there was it was the story from Afghanistan 12 months ago with you know, people coming here in numbers, and you have that issue. It's not just housing people, it's educating children. And how do you do that if the children can't speak English? They don't have that as their lingua franca, as their first language. And again, that can cause many issues that the system needs to be able to resolve.
Yeah, towards the end of this first session, Richard, I think you know, the next question is, you use the term diaspora. How useful is that term, you know, to kind of address the curriculum issues about the diasporas?
Well, again, you've just named an undergraduate module at a university, but then you could have a culturally diverse A-level. You should have subjects at GCSE that cover diasporas and diasporas, plural, not singular. I think the danger with a lot of this conceptual and ideological and definitional debate is that you can get lost in the definitions. I think with any examination of a culturally diverse community, you have to set out your boundaries. I mean, this opening discussion has been general in the sense that both my colleagues will make the subject more specific, and I think that's important. As long as the community is here, and my colleagues proved that A, it is, but then B, for me, it's that movement from research and providing a evidence base to increase understandings for the listeners and the viewers of this program so that they have greater understanding of Kashmiri, its context, its history. Partition just didn't happen in 1947. You've got to explain that region of the world, you know, decolonization, the disintegration of empire, but more importantly, the Kashmiri communities, you know, and their histories, their contexts, and not only what's going on in India and Pakistan with those communities at the moment, but what's going on in England and other countries around the world. Those are fascinating issues. And the bottom line for me is that this is about two things. It's about teachers. It's about giving them the tools so they have the confidence to go into the class to teach cultural diversity. It shouldn't be controversial. It shouldn't be difficult. There are ways and means of teaching most things. some with ethical boundaries that are introduced, but you've got to train the teacher to draw that ethical boundary around the conversation. I was lucky enough to have a mentor that did that for me. So, you know, my conversations immediately broaden, and you can talk about the images of Muhammad in a classroom. You don't show the images, of course, but you talk about the context of different episodes. You can even take it back to Salman Rushdie and the satanic verses if you want in an English context, but teach it factually. Okay, be objective. Talk about episodes and let the students have got it. They've got the knowledge. You know, they eat, breathe, and live it at home. Allow them to bring it into the classroom. That's so important. That's the secret of my job, listeners and viewers, that I learn as much from my students as they do for me. I set debates up. That's what I'm paid to do, not with my own comments or my own viewpoints, but with the history, and let them then make up their own minds. Let them be critical, let them be reflective, let them be contemporary. Wake them up, talk to them about what's going on now, rather than what happened in 1945 or 1066, because that is important in one way, but it's also important to allow students, professional practitioners need to allow students to express themselves at all levels. So in that sense, again, in answer to your question, yes, diaspora needs to be taught, but again, it needs to highlight the complexity of any community and all communities that sound ourselves. Cultural diversity is the biggest strength that we have, and that's in literature, sport, in public, private, voluntary sectors. We should be proud of our heritage, not just a monocultural heritage, but our multicultural heritage, because it's always made us stronger.
Yeah, the last question from you, Richard. You did mention some of the issues about teaching diasporas, but are there any additional issues when it comes to teaching Kashmiri diaspora?
Well, I'm going to leave that to my colleagues because they're the specialists, and I don't want to infringe on their information and their research. But what I will say very quickly is that it's important that we do, first and foremost. That might sound so simple, but it's so true. And as I've said, it's important for the listeners and the viewers to understand that there are different communities in the world. It's not just England, but all over the world where this evidence is vital. And we have to provide, in this specific case, opportunities for, remember, teachers to learn about Kashmiri communities, their histories, their context, where they are to now, what they're thinking and feeling in today, but also giving teachers the strength to teach the students and to allow the students not only to talk, but to reflect and think. And I think that brings more students into the class and makes education more accessible and, dare I say it, more fun.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Richard Reyes. It was very informative and insightful, and I hope it will be very useful for our viewers who are in education in any capacity, whether they are students, pupils, or teachers, or helpers, or researchers. So thank you very much for that. And now we, like you said, our last question was about what are the issues when it comes to teaching Kashmiri diaspora, and we have Dr. Alison with us, Dr. Alison Davies, whose research was for Peterborough Racial Equality Council. And Dr. Alison, thank you very much and welcome. You unmute yourself? Yeah, you done it. You done it. Yeah, and so what was your research about? I mean, can you give us some details that what was it about and how did it come about?
It came about because I work for Peterborough Racial Equality Council as their research officer, and over the last 25 years we've done research on issues of race, obviously of racial equality, or rather inequality, covering some of the issues that Richard has already talked about. and up until 2010, we did quite a lot simply looking at the statistics, achievements, and differences in attainment at Key Stage 2, GCSE, that sort of thing. And then since 2010, we've focused much more on the views and the comments and the suggestions of the students from culturally diverse backgrounds themselves, and to bring those views and those requests in front of the appropriate authorities, whether it's schools or local authority or faith leaders, whatever. We try and work to bring those views in front of them. And so this particular piece of research was Karamat's just finding it. This particular piece of research was collecting the views of 450 students in Peterborough from different culturally diverse backgrounds. But for this presentation, I've picked out the 100 or so who described their own ethnicity as British Pakistani or Kashmiri. So thank you, Karamat. Little bit of background about Peterborough. Population just over 200,000. It's the most recent estimate. In 2011, which is a long time ago, there were 30% from minority ethnic backgrounds. That has definitely gone up since then. We know this from local studies, but of course the 2021 census information is not yet available. There are over 100 languages spoken in Peterborough primary schools, and I'm afraid we're not very good at league tables. We came next to bottom out of all the local authorities in England in both 2017 and 2018 at Key Stage 2, and in 2019, when the systems changed, we were judged as 9% below the national average. So a little bit about the Kashmiri community in Peterborough. Again, from the 2011 census, the population given as British Pakistani in Peterborough was approximately 7%. The heritage areas of the community are mainly from the Mirpur district, the Kotlib district, and the Bimba district, all in Azad, Jammu and Kashmir, and from a smaller proportion from some areas of northern Punjab. And it's important to note that in the research, the participants were asked to choose their own description of ethnicity. There's a principle we have at the Race Equality Council. We respect everybody's own identification. And the comments that I've chosen for this this presentation are those who gave their ethnicity either as British Pakistani or Kashmiri. Thank you. Next. I've explained this in answer to Sharma's question. Some of the research that Peterborough Racial Equality Council has done over the last decade, and the most recent piece of research, which is the subject of this presentation, 450 young people from culturally diverse backgrounds in Peterborough secondary schools completed a survey with open-ended questions. My research colleagues will understand how long that took to analyse, and then follow-up discussions with 40 young people, most of whom were British Pakistani or Kashmiri. And the profile of the overall participants, about 25% of them identified themselves as British Pakistani or Kashmiri, and those are the ones whose views I've highlighted in this presentation. Since then, during lockdown, we have brought those young people together with City Council officers with a project to produce video materials to inform teacher staff development in the city schools. Next, please. The first thing that we asked about was a question: have you personally, in the last year, been the target of racist abuse or racism? And the results from there were that 43% of all participants from culturally diverse backgrounds had experienced racial abuse, and 31% before the referendum for the Brexit vote, and 47% afterwards. That goes along with a lot of research that shows that the language around the politics around the referendum seemed to legitimize abuse against people who were perceived to be immigrants. The situation for Pakistani and Kashmiri respondents was that 51% of them had all said individual racial abuse during the last year. This contrasts, I'm sorry to say, very strongly with what I was told by the school's one senior teacher in a very multicultural school. Told me, oh, well, you won't get any answers to that question because we've eliminated racism in our school. And that rather illustrates Richard's point that we need to hold up these issues to the school authorities and the teachers, as well as reflecting what the students themselves say. Again, with the Kashmiri heritage students, before the referendum, 39% had experienced racism. Afterwards, 56% said they had. And here's just a very few of many, many quotes that they told us in discussions. This is Zahid. A teacher asked, if I called you a P word, would it offend you? The teacher didn't really understand the significance and the severity of the volume behind that word. When my grandfather and the original members of my family came from Pakistan, they were attacked by people shouting that word. And then Atiq said, at the problem schools where most of this stuff happens, a lot of stuff goes around. Social media comes into it a lot because Muslims are always like judged in a way like targets. And if anything happens, it's always the Muslims had something to do with it. The word goes around the whole world and it spreads in schools. And that's why this terrorist word comes out to Muslim people. And one of the survey respondents said, I feel I face racist behaviour around me every day in Western society, as they have a prejudgment and misconception on our customs and religion. Abuse in the media is more of a problem. And I wish those were just isolated comments that I'd picked out. I'm afraid they weren't. They reflect what a lot of students said. Next slide, please. As Richard was saying, oh, sorry, can you go back to the previous one, please? As Richard was saying, the students reflect very much what teachers were, what Richard was saying, that teachers feel awkward about talking about racism. They're white. They don't think it's their place to say anything. They don't really know how to handle the situation. They want to help, but they don't know how to tackle these situations. Another, Fazana said, I feel it's just a lot of misconception by students and teachers. Made me feel uncomfortable. I would classify it as a lack of knowledge that made me feel uncomfortable. And then at national level, a survey of teachers found that teachers lack confidence and training in how to respond to issues concerning race, as Richard was saying. Only 12% had received any training in dealing with racism as part of initial teacher training, and only 1% had received in-service professional training on those issues. That's a very recent survey from the Runnymede Trust. Another issue that came up as very important to the students to tell their teachers was the importance of religion. In Peterborough, 98% of the Kashmiri respondents gave their religion as Islam. 87% said they attended mosque or madrasa at least once a week, and 78% said their religion was very important to them. Thank you. And just a few things that reflected that came out of their lived experiences for Muslim pupils. They told us about changing for PE in mixed-sex classrooms at primary school. Girls had to hide under the tables to get changed. Compulsory shorts uniform for PE, so they had to get their parents to get them out of PE. Most schools do provide halal in alternatives for school lunch, but they're often very poor. I was told, I was just given a plate of salad and a little bun. Some children, they chose to join their families in taking part in the fast during Ramadan, and their school wouldn't let them, even though they made it clear it was their own choice. They weren't being forced to do it. Teachers didn't understand about sacred texts and tried to explain in, say, in RE, but were not respecting the Holy Quran. Lots of examples. Thank you. The next issue, which again Richard has mentioned, is the whole idea of Britishness and the government's strategy to produce what is meant by Britishness. Starting with the Prime Minister David Cameron back in 2011 stating that multiculturalism is dead. We won't debate what he meant by that. My friend Richard describes in great detail the shift from multicultural to integrationist citizenship. Since 2014, schools are required by law to promote what are described as fundamental British values. There is a duty for teachers to report students they feel are vulnerable to being drawn into extremism under the prevent duty. And as Richard has spoken, there's a revision of the national curriculum in England to promote British history and English literature. And most recently, Ofsted is required to monitor pupils' understanding of fundamental British values. So we asked the students about, first of all, what they thought British values were, remember, this is a survey, 450 students all putting down their own answers. And by far the three most popular items that came up that they wrote about, number one was fish and chips, number two was drinking tea, and number three was the Queen. That's what they saw as British values. But when they started talking to us, they understood values. They understood faith values, Islamic values, Christian values, human values, but they didn't understand why any of these were particularly British. So this student said, I have no idea what really constitutes a British value. It's an ever-changing thing. No definitive British value is in practice for all time. Quite a few of them actually expressed the values that they felt they had received from British people, or from white English people, to be precise. And these were discrimination, colonization, hatred, blaming entire groups for the actions of a few, denying the existence of racism and generalization of non-whites. As a white person myself, that makes me think and feel very ashamed. One of the students wrote this wonderful poem. I hope you don't mind me reading it out. Zain Awan was one of the young people involved in the original survey. He's since gone on to be a poet and a photographer, and he keeps up his activism for racial equality. Teach me about British values. How much Britain valued us back when? British values back then? Migrants who build, not migrants who stay. Britain valued lands as plantations, humans as subjects, subjects as cultures, cultures as outfits. Are you worn out yet? Thank you. Next, please. We also discussed, well, the students discussed with us their feelings about the Prevent program. Most of them knew about it. They knew that teachers had a duty to report students who were deemed to be vulnerable. And interestingly, locally, the police make a big thing that the most number of referrals to the next stage of the Prevent program, which is Channel, actually have come from right-wing, white, English right-wing groups. But that's not felt by the Kashmiri heritage students. This is what they felt. Teachers keep watch on certain students. Most times it hurts the students. Teachers can't spot terrorists. Why is it only Muslims affected and targeted by the strategy? Surely other religions have forms of extremism. And one parent told us it's very scary for parents to negotiate around the programme. You have to tell children, don't say this and don't say that. It's a big issue for parents. Thank you. Next, please. Richard has already mentioned the history curriculum in England, but just a few comments that for primary schools, the national curriculum in England for history covers only the Viking invasions and the Anglo-Saxons. It ends in 1066. The main GCSE syllabus offers no or very few options to study history of Africa or the Indian subcontinent. And Black and Asian students are less likely to choose history for GCSE than their white peers, and even fewer at A-levels. And is that hardly surprising? Malika told us she had done history. We learned about the British Empire, but not about the African or the Asian perspective. They should be teaching about people's different histories. And Zahid said students are taught that Africa is a poor country and also South Asia, but they're not taught about colonialism and the effect on the economy. Next, please. Next slide, please. And in English literature, in 2018, 34% of GCSE students nationally were from culturally diverse backgrounds, but less than 1% of candidates answered a question on a novel by a writer of colour. And 82% of students, 82% could not recall ever studying a book or text by a non-white author, despite over a third of the students actually being from culturally diverse backgrounds. And Vazana told us she did English literature A-level. She told us there was no Asian representation at all in A-level English literature. You got the white South Americans in Streetcar Named Desire, but I've never come across a piece of literature with Asian people in it. I've gone out to research about Edwardian England and about Shakespeare and about Southern America. And if there were more books about Asian characters or by Asian authors, students would then have to go out of their way to find out about the context, and that would move forward their understanding a lot. Thank you. Just to conclude, the students, some of those comments sound very negative, but they were overwhelmingly positive about, well, what can schools do about this? They came up with loads and loads of suggestions that won't cost the national education budget much money, but just straightforward things. And I've only been able to list a few of them here, but this gives you a flavour. Schools should have a nominated teacher, like they do for safeguarding, a nominated teacher to whom students can report incidents of racism, and then the schools should acknowledge and confront it. That students should be encouraged to report to this teacher in the knowledge that something will be done. Schools and teachers should be supported to engage with the importance of religion for many students. There should be education and training for teachers so they're able to address stereotypes. And a few comments, Malika, it's important to dismantle racial stereotypes. People don't realise that by fueling stereotypes, they make it harder for people of colour to progress in society. They could do about Islam and stuff like that, and more about culture. And if people knew about it in schools, then racial abuse is less likely to happen. That's Atiq. And Zahid again, he suggested lessons in learning for life that could explain cultures and teach about racism and why it's wrong and why the terms used by other people are hurtful. And the last set of strategies, although as I say there are many, many more in the research, they wanted a quiet room in school for prayer and for fasting during Ramadan in late lunch breaks. Allow girls to wear leggings for PE, not just shorts. Teach people of colour history. Teach world history from the perspectives of the colonised and the enslaved. Select at least one of the texts on the syllabus that are offered by Black and Asian authors. Encourage students to research the contents of world literature text. And to reinforce what Richard said, that needs to increase, include training teachers so they feel confident in teaching texts by Black and Asian authors. And as Karamat has shown very much, also recruiting more teachers from culturally diverse backgrounds. And finally, they wanted open teaching about the recruitment methods used by extremist groups and the real consequences of joining. They felt that the Prevent programme was very covert behind their backs. Thank you. Next slide is just the references, and the final slide is Peterborough City Centre at night. But thank you very much. Anybody who wants to contact me, those are my contact details. Thank you. I can't hear you, Shams.
Thank you very much, Dr. Alison Davies. This was very informative research, and I think it gives very interesting picture of school life, how is seen by people from different cultural backgrounds. And our next guest is Dr. Kramat Iqbal, who is also involved in research concerning education in Britain, and his presentation is on Ethnic Capital, a case study of British Kashmiri parents' role in education. And I will leave you three, Dr. Kramat, to make your presentation, and then you three can conclude it. And so I hope that you will be able to finish within the allocated time. So all the best.
And thanks, Richard and Alison. As the slide tells us, my focus is on Ethnic Capital, which is a case study of British Kashmiri parents' role in education. It started with my work with Tariq Madood, who had coined the phrase ethnic capital. And I was interested in applying it to the British Kashmiris, because we know that social class disadvantage affects the Pakistani community, and within that, the Kashmiri community. And so it has been said that both those communities are disadvantaged in terms of unemployment, poverty, overcrowding, poor health, concentration in deprived neighborhoods, low levels of literacy, overrepresentation in under-resourced schools. We also know that Kashmiri children suffer from being an ethnic minority, from being a Muslim, and from being variously, as they choose to label themselves, as Pakistanis. And sometimes within the Pakistani category, they suffer because of being Kashmiris. There are anti-Kashmiri prejudices that work against the Kashmiri community. And yet, the Kashmiri community, and more broadly the Pakistani community, sends a disproportionate number of their children to university. I think both Tariq, Maudud, and I were wanting to know why this was. Why was it that the children were achieving against the odds? And so we wanted to use Tariq's concept, ethnic capital, which was something he had coined with his work. I think it was mainly in Slough amongst the Pakistani community, but we know many of the Slough Pakistanis are actually Kashmiris. And at the time, Maudud was trying to understand his research question was, why do British Pakistanis have such a high level of participation in higher education when they are a disadvantaged community? And in particular, he wanted to know, why is such a disadvantaged group who are socio-economically disadvantaged, racially excluded, and lacking in dominant social capital and dominant cultural capital? Why is it such a community, a high achieving community in terms of the number of children they send to higher education? And Maudud had his inspiration from two concepts, ethnicity as resource and ethnic social capital. And he coined the definition of ethnic capital in these words: a non-dominant form of social capital consisting of norms, practices, and strategies of Pakistani individuals, families, and communities. It focuses specifically on three things that he thought explained educational success: familial adult-child relationships, transmission of aspirations and attitudes, and norms enforcement. He presented a certain causal sequence. Number one, parents and the family have ambitions to achieve upward social mobility. Secondly, they believe that education is the important way of achieving their ambitions. Thirdly, and consequently, they prioritize the acquisition of education. The parents use their authority and power and their relationship to convey this to the children. The children internalize the message and develop ambitions and priorities that are consistent with those of their parents. And finally, the children do whatever is necessary to realize the ambitions. My research was conducted amongst 7 Kashmiri academics. And because they are academics, that would give you a clue that they were educationally successful. Some had PhDs, some were working towards PhDs, some had masters or were graduates or were working for these qualifications. I interviewed them, usually lasting about an hour. I then transcribed, analyzed the data, and the findings were that all the parents we heard about valued education and found different ways to engender respect for it in their child. The parents provided good parenting, encouraged the child to do their best. The parents provided the educational air that they breathed. I think one interviewee told me there was an educational vibe in their family and an extended community. Even parents who didn't have the confidence to go to a parents' evening at home did their job of encouragement. Read you this quote from about a mother who had not gone to school herself at all, had said to her son, or her son is describing her, "My mother has always been supportive of education. She would get us ready and take us to school and always push us. She would make sure there were no other demands on my time, so I was able to focus on my education." The parents showed their pride for their child's achievement. The parents used their own life experience of not doing well in education or not having the opportunities to say to their child, "Learn from my mistakes or learn from my misfortune and try hard." This quote from one interviewee, my father would talk about how he hadn't done well in education, something he didn't want for his children. And another parent saying, "Education will help you, stay with you, nobody can take it away." The extended family played a very important role in that they reinforced the messages that the parents had given. Whenever there were family gatherings, there was education talk. How's your child doing? And what they really wanted to do was tell you about their child because they were proud of the child. And they would then encourage each other, share notes on how to do it, how to support the child. Uncles would talk about education and its importance. The community provided an encouraging infrastructure. One quote, "My aunties are always supporting and encouraging. They would frequently stress to me and to my mum how important education was. Cousins who had achieved in education would be looked up to for their example." And here's a quote about an uncle. When the child's own parents had not been to school and could not speak much English and certainly couldn't read and write, therefore didn't understand the education system. This is what he says about his uncle. "My uncle was educated. He was a role model for me. It gives you an opportunity to see how things are different in terms of they've been educated, how their lifestyle is different to our lifestyle, for example, or in terms of the manual work my father was doing compared to the professional work my uncle was doing." Here's some detail. It was a mixed picture when it came to providing learning materials. The earlier generation, these were interviewees born in the early 70s. So they were children of first-generation migrants. They had a kind of hit and miss whether they had any learning materials. There was very little money in their family to buy the learning materials. You know, one child said to me, we had 3 books, a children's book, a quiz book, and a book of spelling and grammar, and that was it. But the situation did improve for the youngest respondents who reported greater provision of learning materials. Homework was, again, a mixed picture. Most parents monitored the homework. However, many were not able to help. And my own research in 2015 to 2017 found that Pakistani children, which is how I was describing them and categorizing them, they did have a problem in that their parents were often not able to help them with their homework. And in my research, some of the children were too busy because they were going to the mosque. But my respondents told me that their parents, even if they couldn't help them with their homework, were still involved in that they would ask questions about it. But there's no getting away that we are dealing with a disadvantaged community, and my respondents were coming from that community. So they were reporting that they had shared bedrooms, the family dynamics. You could never predict when they would be quiet. And the parents couldn't help the children. Parents' meetings at school, the earlier generation didn't attend those. And if they did attend them, they wouldn't understand what was going on. But the younger parents attended more. Also, extended family members attended such meetings when parents couldn't. One other thing I looked at, because out of my 7, 2 or 3 were children of first-generation immigrants, and there was one particularly, a woman, and through her I was able to get a glimpse of how the community saw, how the Kashmiri community saw her education as a woman in those 70s and 80s. And I was able to compare it with the later generation. And in the earlier phases, our community did not value girls' education. And when a girl was sent to school, allowed to complete her secondary education beyond reaching puberty, and furthermore, if she was allowed to go to further education, sometimes away from the home, the relatives would interfere and say, well, your daughter shouldn't be allowed to go so far away from home on her own on the bus. You never know what she might get up to. But I'm pleased to say those attitudes have changed, and some of the younger women I interviewed told me that there was no problem. They were treated equally in their families, equally with their brothers. So in conclusion, I would say that educational drive is integral to the lives of British Kashmiri parents and families. Parenting was central to the process. The children became regular attenders at school, were respectful of their teachers, worked hard, generally focused on academic matters as necessary, completed homework if they could, but generally they followed the advice of their parents, which was to respect the teachers and work hard and behave well and attend regularly. The parents had clear rules and regulations regarding their children's leisure activities. They generally knew where their child was. the ethnic capital of the Kashmiri parents compensated for their economic disadvantage. Family norms and the broader community networks and values provided the aspirational air for the young. School teachers and educational policymakers should inform themselves of what the Kashmiri parents do at home and in the community. This will enable the teachers to show more respect to the parents and will also help them to build on what the parents have already put in place in the children, the values they've given to the child. And it will help the teachers and the policymakers to create better homeschool partnerships. And the last point I'd like to make is this was a small-scale research project. My recommendation is that similar research should be undertaken, but with a larger cohort and with a particular focus, not just on ethnic minorities or Asians or Muslims or Pakistanis, those broad categories, but with a particular focus on the Kashmiris, whose children are one of the largest ethnic minorities in the schools. Thank you very much. Right, over to Richard.
Okay, colleagues, thank you very much for those two presentations. I've got questions, too many questions as always with limited time, but I'd like to ask Karamat the first question. Your first conclusion talks about an educational drive. How do you do that? What do you mean by that? I mean, I know what you mean by that, but again, how do we get a system that seems to be structured against issues such as the ones that we've been discussing for our audience in relation to this program? What are the keys to enabling, I think that's an interesting word, enabling an educational drive to make the materials that we've been discussing today more accessible?
I think in summary, what I would say is traditionally we have known of concepts like the immigrant paradigm, where when they arrive in a new place, and we know from work about the Chinese community, for example, that when they arrive in a new place, they usually don't manage to access the education system themselves, but they do their damnedest to make sure their own children have all the advantage, and they invest all the resources, all the time, all the effort, all the encouragement into the child, send the child with a particular mindset to the school system, to the further education and university system, and say, go and respect education, respect teachers, work hard. And generally the children do, of course, accepting that there is educational underachievement amongst those communities. So for some, there's no matter how much drive you have, no matter how much encouragement you have, you're still disadvantaged because maybe of your social class or your ethnicity, where you live, which school you attend, and so on. So generally speaking, within immigrant communities, that drive, that immigrant paradigm is there. They want their children to do well and achieve high professions. I think we need to find ways of understanding it, encouraging it, building on it, and respecting the parents and the community who initiate that drive in the first place. So there are implications, I would say, for both your areas of work, both Alison and yourself, in terms of working with teachers, because we know when a parent doesn't show up at a parents' evening, they are categorized as hard to reach, and before you know it, they're labeled. And actually, those same parents could be doing something amazing at home. And it's because of that their child is doing so well.
Very interesting thoughts there. Thank you for that response. Moving across to Alison. Alison, I was fascinated by the statistics that you revealed to the audience in relation to racism and racist abuse. Of your sample, 43% claimed that they had been racially abused, and 51%, which is over half of the Kashmiri Pakistani community as well. Here's a simple question that has a very complicated answer. How do we teach racism in all sections or sectors of education?
Do you mean anti-racism?
Yes, Alison. That's a question for Alison. Sorry, Alison.
Well, I think we've gone backwards. When I was trained as a teacher in inner London a very long time ago, we studied anti-racist education. That has all been squeezed out of teacher training programs. So I know that probably doesn't help. But what the answer that the students would give is yes, educate teachers about not perpetuating stereotypes, how they rise, all that sort of thing, but then how to handle reports of racism, and by confronting stereotypes about different communities, I think is the first step, and certainly the young people would say is the first step to getting people to understand each other. And for students to, one of the things they asked for, which I didn't have time to include, they wanted more events, organised events that brought together people from different communities to learn from each other. That was what they said. They're big believers in contact theory, although they probably hadn't ever studied it. And yes, they just wanted to get opportunities to get to know each other, and to learn about each other's cultures, each other's histories, so that other people they all understood each other better, which to them was the first step of then not making stupid racist comments.
And I think that's really interesting as well, in the sense that it sounds so simple that we bring communities into schools as experts in their context, their history, and it sort of changes it changes fundamentally schools' relationships. But I think teachers and senior leaders have got to be comfortable with that, in the sense that it's not about inviting parents to come in and do the jobs of teachers. It's actually sharing their experiences, sharing their knowledge, to allow, not only, as I suggested earlier, not only allow teachers, but also students to increase their understandings of their own histories, because they're probably getting this at home. But I think it would be interesting as the school as a setting, or college or university as a setting, to allow these discussions to take place. And I think that's really interesting. I also believe that with racism, you've also got to teach at all levels and have an understanding of race, racism, structural racism, institutional racism, before you get to notions such as whiteness, white privilege, critical race theory, which has become very topical recently, but can, I would suggest, be taught objectively rather than factually. And I think that's within an academic freedom boundary. And again, these issues have to be taught, can be taught, provides fascinating conversations for students as well as teachers, not in a threatening way, but in an educational way. Which brings me to another question for Karamat, in the sense that, again, this seems like an obvious question, but I think it's incredibly complicated. How, Karamat, do we get more schools? Let's just keep it at schools, primary and secondary schools. Secondary schools, Key Stage 3, Key Stage 4 in England. How do we get more schools to teach Kashmiri, Pakistani citizenship, history, literature? How do we get more schools to actually deliver this content to not only Kashmiri students, but students from other cultural, diverse communities?
That's $1 million question, Richard. I think multicultural education, anti-racist education seems to have been deprioritized, gone off the agenda. Right from teacher training level, there's very little time on teacher training, for example, to discuss these issues, and very little time in the school CPD programs for these issues. We have the Black History Month, but there's been an ongoing battle with that to mainstream it. So it's not just for 1 month, but actually for the whole year. And there is early kind of struggle going on to place South Asian history on the curriculum. And the hostile environment is not just there for immigration and Black and minority ethnic people in society, but the hostile environment is also there for multicultural education. And so I think there are some big struggles that we have. And for the Kashmiri community, there is an additional struggle in that many of them are labeled Pakistanis because their parents and grandparents traveled on Pakistani passports. And so ethnic categorization records them as Pakistanis. 2/3, maybe even 3/4 of them, of our children in schools, are not Pakistani, but they're actually Kashmiri. But sadly, the awareness of that fact is very low amongst teachers and education policymakers and academics. And there's been very little written about it, and very little literature. And I've got an article coming in the Bira blog saying something like, majority of Pakistanis are Kashmiris and they speak Pahari as a language. And so we are in the very early stages of talking about the Kashmiri community, and we must do more. This kind of discussion and a recent one that I've done with an academic on the Pahari language, which was to show that Kashmiri children speak Pahari, not Urdu. When they say to you, I speak Urdu, or my national language, or my mother tongue is Urdu, they're not actually telling you the full truth. And because they think you won't understand, but they actually speak Pahari. So I think we have some work to do when it comes to the British Kashmiri diaspora, the Kashmiri community itself, but the thousands of Kashmiri children in the British school system.
I totally agree with that. I mean, again, I think if you're an advocate of multicultural education, like I am, Alison mentioned the stereotypes. You teach those when you talk about country, but when you have the identities exercise, when I get all of my students to actually define their identities, plural rather than singular, I ask them how many languages and dialects they can speak. And of course, you get students all over the world, not just from Kashmiri, who are saying 3, 4, 5 languages and dialects, which again, I think underlines not only the cultural diversity, but the complexity of the region, which, as I totally agree with you, you've got to have an understanding of if you're teaching it. But I think, as we all agree, you've got to provide the environment for professional practitioners at all levels to increase understandings of the one community and the many. It's about you. It's for a teacher. It has to be about the students in front of them. It's not about the teacher or the lecturer, however defined. It's about the students, and again, it's providing them with the opportunity to express themselves. Yes, bring the community into the school if there are no experts. I mentioned that term, cultural facilitator. Use the community. Don't abuse the community by giving them too much responsibility and doing half of your job. But if they can come in and help and improve professional practice, and we can have greater connections, because of course they exist and they've existed for many, many years and decades, collaboration between community, school and community. And I think that is one of the ways, perhaps the major way, of getting this material across. So there's a lot going on in the background, and when it's actually taught in the classroom, in many subjects, not just one, but many subjects, again, there can be raising of cultural awareness for the students as well as the teachers. Now, my friends, we have reached our time deadline exactly. Shams, are you there?
No, I think he's probably disappeared.
Thank God for editing then, that's all I can say. That's a shame, but I think we've hit the target, my friends. I think that's very good, actually.
Yes.
What did you think? Alison, what did you think about the last 2 hours or so?
Yes, I think it was. Are we still being recorded?
I think
I can
we are.
stop it if you want to say one final comment, and I will then stop the broadcast. It's all
this bit will be edited out, Alison. I mean, what I just